Welcome to Aim in Practice, where we talk about life as a practitioner, wellness in general, and what it means to practice. I'm your host, Jess Reynolds, and in this episode, I have the privilege of speaking with Laurann. Now, Laurann is a voice and dialect coach, and we talk about all sorts of really awesome things, like the importance of this thing called code switching, flexible communication in the wellness industry and in our practice, and we also talk about the emotional and physical dimensions of our voice and how to train it. Now, I've always believed that our voice plays a role in the therapeutic setting, but I never knew just how important it was. So this was a truly fascinating conversation where I learned a ton. So with that, let's jump in. Well, Laurann, welcome and thank you very much. I have to say, I have been super looking forward to this conversation. So this is our sort of rebooking time, right? And like what we met first time probably 2-3 months ago. And ever since then, I've been thinking this conversation will be so much fun. I'm super interested in what you do, which is, of course, voice. So I would like to start with you just telling your story. What got you into wellness? Because after having read your bio, you're pretty versatile. You've done a lot of things in the wellness industry, right? So we'll dip our toe into each one of those. But in particular, what brought you to studying voice and really focusing on that as this main modality that you practice these days?
Yeah, thank you for asking such a wonderfully complex question, Jess. Right
off the bat. It is, isn't it?
What brought me to this? It's an interest. Well, I guess like most of us, right? We come into the wellness industry, all of us, usually through many channels. My job title is technically a voice and dialect and communication coach. What I call myself. I worked for a long time in England, in the United Kingdom, where voice coaching there means speaking, spoken voice, training actors for the stage, that kind of thing. In Canada, in North America, when I say voice coaching, people often think I'm a singing teacher. And they go, oh, you teach singing. I work with singers. I have worked with singers and working with their breath and their body, but I don't actually teach singing. It's around the speaking voice and teaching people how to speak, but to teach speech, you have to understand breath. To understand breath, you have to understand the body, the anatomy, the biomechanics of breathing, the biomechanics of sound, which means the larynx and the throat and neck, the biomechanics and science of speech, which means you're dealing with all the muscles of the mouth, the oral cavity, the nasal cavity. So you're kind of basically dealing with the head to toe human being in order to teach speech, which is so interesting. So I was an actor for a while, and I was a child who did drama and dance and singing and all those typical stagey kinds of things. But funny enough, that's not what got me into voice teaching. I had the experience as a child of having some illness. I had arthritis as a young teenager that lasted for a few years and impacted on my ability to move. Right? I couldn't run, I couldn't dance, I couldn't do gym classes. I could play piano kind of, but my hands weren't great. And it was about 3 years of restricted movement, lots of physio treatments, medication, which it went away. Juvenile rheumatoid arthritis is a known childhood illness that doesn't last into adulthood. But what didn't go away is that I became really shy and quite a bit more introverted than I had been before that. And I didn't really notice this. This is sort of a hindsight thinking. And so through my teen years and into my early 20s, I was a little more shy and a little more kind of reserved. And around 21-ish, I started studying massage therapy because I thought I want to do something with my hands. I want to do something, helping people. I wanted to combine my interest in being active with my interest in releasing tension and finding calm, not realizing, of course, I needed that myself, partially from these childhood experiences. The other experience that feeds into this is that I have anaphylactic food allergies and have done since I was a baby, since I was 6 months old. And I have had, at last count, over 25 very serious, we might call them near-death experiences, where my system has started to shut down and I've experienced anaphylaxis. And then all the knock-on effects of anaphylaxis in the days that follow, the recovery phases of it, which of course is all about tension, the body freezing, locking, holding, contracting. And then I had to learn how to unravel that so that I could carry on through those things. So when I came to massage therapy, again, not fully putting all this together, I was very drawn to things that created relaxation, that released tension, that brought a sense of kind of centeredness and wholeness. Right. And the great thing is, I'm sure you know, when you're practicing something like massage training, not only do you give people massages, you get lots of massages. So your classmates can practice on you. And so suddenly I was receiving massage, I don't know, several times a week, and noticing that, wait, not only do I feel great about what I'm learning, I feel more confident. I feel happier. My body moves better. I feel my personality is kind of shifting and opening up and changing. And so that became something I was really curious about. That inspired me to go back and study acting again. So I started taking acting classes in my mid-20s. And then I was in a really serious car accident. T-boned by someone, didn't see them coming, wasn't my fault, hit my head here, hit my head there, neck, back, injuries, unconscious for a while, hospital, blah, 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 broken ribs. And so again, I'm back in recovery mode, right? And it's a complex thing. There's brain trauma, there's PTSD, there's muscle tissue injury. And so I was in a very full program of recovering from this accident. Luckily, I had my massage training. Luckily, I understood about breathing for calming nervous system stuff. As part of my recovery, I started doing yoga, and this is back 25 years ago, so it wasn't as popular as it is now. But I started practicing yoga and realizing this connection between breathing and moving and calming. And so that brought in this breath and movement piece into this recovery work that I was doing. And then around that time in my acting training, I was introduced to this sort of a conference, I guess it was called the Canadian National Voice Intensive, which doesn't run in the same way anymore as it used to. So in 2002, I traveled to Vancouver for 5 weeks and took an intensive 5-week-long, Monday to Friday, 8 to 5 training course in all the facets of voice and body and movement and accent and speech and creativity and text work and Shakespeare, all of it for 5 weeks. And while I was there, my brain just went, I swear there was a light bulb over my head following me around, because I always say that was my light bulb moment when I went, do you mean there's a thing that I could do, a subject that I could teach that talks about emotion, nervous system, past stuff that comes up and comes through, anatomy, physiology, poetry, language, speech, science, movement, creativity, dance, performance. And there's a job title that does all of that. And I was so excited. So that was when this was about 20 years ago now, I guess. And I had this sort of epiphany and went, how do I get that? And so I finished my bachelor's degree in theater studies at UBC in Vancouver. Then I moved to England and did a master's degree in voice studies at the Royal Central School of Speech and Drama, which is one of the most well-known institutions in the world for voice training. And stayed in London and worked for 13, 14 years, teaching voice to actors, to dancers, public speaking with business executives and corporate folks, and doing accent softening. So working with people who speak English as a second language, improving their pronunciation, not taking away accents.
Yeah.
So that is how I got here.
Wow, there's a lot packed in there. Like as you were just going over your bio, I almost wanted to reach and find a piece of paper because about 50 questions came up. None of which were on the little document that I sent you of here's the questions I might ask. There's just so much territory in there I want to cover. So So I think what I'd like to do is just dig into some of that. I mean, when I was hearing you talking about that light bulb moment, even in this brief moment of having the discussion with you, is I can sense that in myself, just like how important and powerful voice is. And like they say, when a person smiles, you can tell a fake smile because it doesn't touch the eyes. I call shenanigans. I think a person can fake a smile into their eyes. That's called acting, right? Like that's what we do. But what's the interesting thing is I think voice is so much harder to fake. Like if you're not feeling happy, you could put the happy expression on, but then your voice still has kind of that bland right? So there's just so much packed into voice when it comes to things like emotion and communication ultimately being like the thing, right? So what's a great place to start as far as tarot? You know what? Let's actually talk a little bit about perhaps the series of pretty traumatic things that happen in your life. You know, from juvenile arthritis, which is no joke. Like
No.
that alone is like
Yeah.
enough to steer the direction of a person's life, combined with
Yeah.
repeated anaphylactic scenarios, combined with what sounds like a very horrific accident. It's like one after
Yeah.
another after another. Have you by chance connected those experiences to voice? Like, how did those experiences in your own experience change how you speak? You talked a little bit about confidence
Mm.
in there too. So in
Yeah.
just in your story, how did that manifest and unfold?
Interesting. Yeah, it's such a good question. And there's about 50 ways I could answer that. My brain's like, oh, where do I start? How do I unpick
Yeah.
that? So I think I'm going to start by sharing an anecdote with you that I learned from one of my teachers, because understanding the framework of how the voice industry, the voice coaching industry looks at the voice. What is the voice? What is the function of the voice? What affects the voice? What makes it work? What prevents it from working? That sort of those guiding principles and those ideas about what the voice is one of the things that spoke to me so powerfully. So I love sharing this story. I always tell this story when I start working with a new group of students, if I'm training actors or training people for public speaking. When I was in my early 20s, I had this voice teacher who is one of the best known teachers in Canada. Certainly his name is David Smuckler. He was training actors' voices for decades and decades. And he was one of my teachers, and he is a very tall man, very imposing looking, sort of big, shock of gray and black hair and this very dramatic kind of profile. And of course he had an amazing speaking voice, so rich and resonant and powerful. And he said to us in his very imposing way, he said, "What is the voice?" And we were, keen students, and we were, the vocal folds vibrate. And he said, "No." And we're like, you breathe in and your intercostal muscles. And he said, "No." And we were like, what do you want us to say? This sort of panic of the student trying to get the question right. And he said, "It is a response." And I kind of went, oh my gosh. And so he sort of unpacked this to explain the voice. If you think about it, I stop speaking, my voice goes away. Where did it go? What other part of our body just disappears when you're not using it, right? You don't use your arm. It's not gone. It's just not in use. But if you stop speaking, your voice is gone. And so that sound that you hear, the sound of speech that you're hearing, is a reaction, a response to the functioning of the mechanical system of breathing, vocal fold function, vibration in the larynx, and speech. And it carries an imprint about the health of that system.
Yeah.
And so one of the images, a wonderful teacher of mine called Barbara Hausman, she uses this image in her book, and I love it so much. She says, the voice is a bridge between the inner world and the outer world. And on that bridge of our voices, we actually hear the state of someone's inner world.
Yeah.
Which is just kind of mind-blowing when you think about it. And so you already gave that example, it's really hard to lie in your voice. It's really hard, right? We've all had the experience of, phoning someone or speaking to someone that you can't see, and they pick up a phone and they say, "Hi," or "Hello." And right away you go, "What's wrong? Are you okay?" Why would you know that if you can't see them, right? You're hearing their inner world reflected in their voice.
Yeah.
Or when someone's trying to put on, that smile to the eyes, and they're like, "Hi, how are you? Nice to see you."
Yeah.
And even though they might sound perky or happy, you can almost feel the inauthenticity behind it, or you can feel the tension that's driving that expression. And so you might ask the same question, "Are you okay?" Even when they sounded chirpy or cheerful. So the voice creates information, really unique information.
The example that you just gave there it's somebody being all like, "Hey, how are you?" I'm so curious about that pitch up. My understanding of the reason we pitch up is something to do with it makes one sound a little bit less intimidating, being that we've got sort of these deep psychological mechanisms that respond poorly to those growly type voices. You know, it's kind of a scary thing. And then the opposite, the chirpy, happy voice sort of leads to some sort of calmness. That's like the only understanding I have, because I have been curious about why is it that when we're trying to talk a little bit cheery, the voice goes up, or what I call the grandma voice, right? You're just chilling out and grandma calls you, and you're like, grandma, hi. Somehow the voice goes up like 10. What's with that? Like, why does the voice raise when we're trying to be cheery and happy? And because when I'm actually cheery and happy, my voice doesn't do that. It's only when I'm putting on the cheery, happy voice.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. So the authentic happiness in you doesn't sound the same as that. So when I'm listening to you describe those situations, I might describe it as a slightly surprised happiness, like, oh, I didn't expect to have to say that right now. So there's a bit of a startle response in that, even though it may not be a fear response. There's a bit of a startle reaction, that unexpected, oh, hi, right? There's an unexpected, which on some level is a little bit of a fear response. Or the other scenario that you're describing, you know, you pick up a phone and it's grandma, or it's your boss, or it's someone that you're either a little bit intimidated by or you have respect for. And then we go, oh, hi, how are you? Nice to. And so there's a status thing going on there, perhaps, right? Maybe a role, a status, I think is the best word. You know, what is your relationship to that person? And if you are perceive yourself as being not beneath them, but for them to have a higher status than you, it's really normal to shift the way that we communicate in response to status, perceived status. And that's a slightly different answer. So to answer the first one, that kind of, oh, hi, yeah, that kind of startled response, if you will, that sort of up pushed cheeriness. There's lots of different reasons. It's all very complex, right? Yeah. But one reason, tell me what you said again. You said the reason being to stop the fear of like the low growly, the intimidation factor. Okay. So that speaks to this fear response, startle response. As I'm sure you are familiar with, the fight or flight response, the activated vagus nerve is our danger reaction that happens in our brain unconsciously to keep us safe, right? And now research shows it's not just fight or flight. There's actually 5 different ways that we might respond, the 5 Fs. We might go into fight mode, you know, fight off the bear, get aggressive, protect ourselves and our loved ones. Flight, we might want to run away or talk too fast. That can manifest in talking really, really fast, or kind of becoming sort of fidgety and nervous and jittery. That's part of the flight response. The fawn or friend response is sometimes called, the sudden desire to make friends with or placate the situation or the person that has created the startle. And biologically that makes sense, right? If I can charm you and if I can convince you that I'm okay, then maybe whatever my perceived threat in this situation is will calm down. And so if we're trying to calm someone or befriend someone from a place of stress response, using a higher pitched voice makes us sound smaller and lighter and weaker. And so it becomes a status thing. I am not very threatening if my voice goes up and high and little, and I might sound sort of childlike, so I'm putting myself in a non-threatening position to the person that I'm speaking to. So that's 3. We've also got the freeze reaction. So our nervous system just tells us don't move, you know, the deer in the headlights. If I stop and freeze, maybe they won't see me. Or if I play dead, you know, the predator will walk on by. And so that freeze response freezes up all the muscles in our body, including our voice, including our larynx. And the larynx will often freeze in a raised position because the larynx, the muscles around the larynx are connected to the jaw, the tongue, the neck. And so if we go, and I'm sort of imitating freezing, but we clench our jaw shut, don't make any noise. The tongue will often pull up in the mouth and stick to the roof of the mouth. Well, that pulls your larynx up. And the high-pitched voice is produced by a larynx that is raised. So if we've gone, and then we start talking, we might have a higher-pitched voice coming out of that freeze state. And if we're someone who spends a fair bit of time in freeze state, that might actually encourage a habitual position of the larynx in a raised position, right? And then the last one is the fight, flight, friend, freeze.
Feign?
Oh, no, I've just forgotten
Is it feign death?
That would be freeze. Flop,
Freeze
sorry,
death.
flop. Sorry, flop,
yeah.
yeah, it's the last one. And that's that collapse, which is kind of similar to the feigning death, yeah. So that rather than freezing and holding still, we get a feeling of collapse. Yeah, so feigning death, collapsing. And if we're an animal and we don't want to get eaten by a bear, flopping to the ground and appearing to be lifeless could save our life. But if we're a human being and we're faced with stress, becoming collapsed or becoming disengaged is generally problematic. The flop state probably doesn't drive the larynx up as much. That's probably more likely to hear because of the relaxation of the body. That's when we're almost more likely to hear that depression in the voice.
Yeah.
You know, someone who sounds low and kind of flat and monotone and heavy.
Totally.
But all the other states, fight, flight, freeze, friend, are all going to drive the larynx upwards due to that activation of the nervous system. And that upward drive of the larynx creates a higher pitch in the voice. And so even if the stress response is a positive one, surprise, it's your birthday, I'm here visiting you from the other, oh my God, I can't believe you're here. You know, it's still a surprise. It's still a shock to the system. And so our nervous system kicks into that fear response. Does that make sense?
That makes complete sense. Yeah, that put a lot of pieces together. And, you know, when you describe these 5 Fs, you know, you are talking about the trauma response, the fight or flight, the survival response, right? Sympathetic, all these different interchangeable names, sure. But I'm going to call it the trauma response for the sake of this particular part of the discussion. Is what I'm curious about within that is what we now know fairly conclusively, particularly through Stephen Porges' model of the vagal theory, right? Is what can happen with an individual if they do not complete the trauma cycle, you know, because this is supposed to be for our survival, meaning if you run away and you survive, you've successfully done it. But if you run away and it doesn't lead to, I guess, resolving the situation that is traumatic, then we kind of like stay in that flight phase, right? I mean, that's a dramatic oversimplification of the model. But what I'm trying to get at here is I can start to see how the muscles and the physical structures you just described, you know, the larynx being one of them, the jaw being another one, can also get stuck in this phase. Let's assume somebody gets stuck in the maybe even that flop or the feign phase where it is that like I can't escape this. I'm just going to totally shut down, shut off. I can imagine how that would strongly affect voice. Like they do, I would imagine, correct me if I'm wrong, but I would imagine there would be a significant lack of inflection. And whether or not the person's voice is low or high, that lack of inflection certainly is not appealing to be around. We know what like the Eeyore voice. It's always that down talk, life is super, right? So what I'm getting at with this is how that, just that simple thing can affect almost every aspect of their life, everything from getting a job to building strong relationships. This isn't even talking about the fact that they're dealing with some pretty significant underlying trauma that has who knows how many other repercussions. I'm just isolating this discussion exclusively to voice that, just that, and vice versa. Somebody gets stuck in the maybe the flea, and quite frankly, that high pitched sort of that anxiety, that talking too fast, like that's not very fun either to experience as a listener. So fascinating stuff.
100%. You've absolutely nailed it, Jess, in terms of how those nervous system states can become like any muscle tension, right? Muscle tension becomes our default habit if we don't work to release that tension and find a way to work with our body in a way that is aligned and that is fluid and flexible.
Right.
That was one of my great discoveries when I came to yoga in my early 20s. You know, by that time I had experienced all of these physical traumas and some psychological traumas and didn't know how much patterning I was holding in my body that was negatively impacting on my rate of breathing, where I was breathing, the pitch and the color of my voice. So many things. And I started practicing yoga, and I can still remember my very first yoga class. I can still remember it vividly. It was somewhere on 17th Avenue. I don't know exactly where was now, but anyway, upstairs in a studio. I'd never done yoga before. I went into this class, and of course, all the downward dogs and all the stretching through the legs, the backs of my legs, my calves. I'd been a waitress for years at this point and had never considered this relationship between the top half and the bottom half of my body. And as I walked out of that yoga studio, I can still remember the feeling of walking down 17th Avenue and my foot striking the ground and feeling like the shape and size of my entire foot almost like sinking through the sidewalk. I don't think I'd ever felt my lower body so profoundly. I felt so grounded. I felt so heavy, but in like a really positive way.
Yeah.
It kind of blew my mind. And I can still remember that feeling. And that was 25 years ago.
Yeah.
So that all of those things together had created, obviously, even though I was functioning and I was living a life and doing things, I obviously had some high functioning patterning going on. And as I unraveled, from the car accident and all those other things, added the yoga, added the breathing, added the creativity of acting, I started going even deeper and going even further. And so many things to say, but one of the things that, as a voice teacher, I'm not a therapist, although I'm very interested in somatic experiencing. And that's where I see my work going, is actually digging deeper into proper therapeutic work. Because when people come to you to work on their voice and they say, oh, I talk too fast, I breathe too high, I have no inflection, right away, I know I'm starting to step into potential of unnoticed, unresolved trauma territory.
Yeah.
Right. And I have to be very careful and walk a really clear line, but it's pretty normal that stuff comes up because people don't realize. And so handling that with sensitivity, making sure people have the right support system in place, educating people on, what trauma can look like and how to sort of gently be working to decompress. All of that starts to come in to being a voice teacher, which is super interesting.
It is, and I could certainly see it, right? I mean, as you were describing that, a few things came into mind, particularly with the SE part, but, in cranial, SER, somatic, I can't remember that, but there's
somatic
level 2 cranial, right? Is they talk about putting the body in the position it was in during the traumatic experience, which kind of helps resolve this, right? And a lot of the time when we're doing manual therapies or yoga, we can certainly create these emotional responses, these spontaneous emotional outbursts of a variety of type. And while there has yet to be any conclusive description as to this is why that happens, my working theory, which, I mean, it's my theory, so I'm pretty damn proud of it, but my working theory is you're essentially reminding the entire nervous system, you're putting it back into that state. And it's just like when you walk through the mall and you smell, like a perfume or a cologne of somebody used to know it. You remember. You put the body back into that same sensory position. You remember. So what I'm getting at with this is, I can only imagine if, say, for example, you get somebody who's locked in that Eeyore voice, right? And through voice training, you compel them, you ask them to change their voice to be more dynamic. And in the same way that when we can use something like yoga to give people more access to aspects of their psyche and spiritual world, I could only imagine how giving people access to different registers of their voice would open up an inner psychological realm, and could 100%. Also be dangerous. Perhaps you're working with somebody and you're working through, maybe it's a singer or an actor, and you're trying to teach them how to do the gravelly, gritty voice, but they don't access that, and they hit that voice, and it brings up this deep desire to scream and shout. And so sure, I could see how there's this completely intrinsic connection between somebody's emotional inner experience and their voice, particularly what might come up during voice training.
Yeah, 100%. And, and we, again, as voice teachers, we say this all the time. It's not therapy. I'm not a therapist. It's not appropriate. We have to learn how to walk that line. And we always tell our students, stuff comes up. It just does. And even if it's not deep rooted trauma stuff, right? Releasing, as in a massage, someone can just get in and, get a good shoulder release going, and you just find there's tears, there's emotion there. It's not necessarily connected to a horrific event. It's just the feeling of relief in the muscle triggers a release in the body. And that release often comes through, tears and crying or, that kind of thing, which is normal and healthy. And so the sort of mandate for voice teachers is, so long as the emotional release that happens, and I've experienced it, my students have experienced it, so long as we put it back into the work that we're doing, then that's what's appropriate. So if someone is doing some breathing work and there's emotion coming up, what I'll encourage them to do is keep working with their breath, maybe back off a little bit if it's too much, and let's just play with sound. Let's make some open sounds. Let's play with movement. Let's dissipate that energy in a way that is still in keeping with the creative, explorative work that we're doing. And it does not require them to tell me their story. Yeah. Right?
I mean, that's kind of the definition of SE. It's like that the whole point of all of these somatic works, and I use SE because it's the most popular one, but as you know, like there's a huge field of somatic therapies out there. I mean, my opinion is TCM is at its essence a somatic therapy. It's this huge realm of it that it's like your story, cool story, like that's great. Yeah. The words don't matter quite as much as the physical sensation. The words can help,
lingering effects,
obviously, right?
Yeah. And for a lot of people, they go through one or two big release experiences when they first start the training, because they're, like anything, your body's not used to it. It's brand new. I've cried through countless yoga classes. Things are happening in my life, and we do the hip opening, and I'll just sit there being like, okay, hips, we just need to, but I know that if I keep going to yoga and I keep working through those same movements, I won't cry anymore because my body's adjusted and adapted. So what often happens for people in a training session is there's a big response maybe at the very beginning, but if we keep going with the work, we keep focused on the appropriate outlet, is that their voice starts to change, right? They gain something in their speaking, better breathing, more resonance, more pitch range, more energy. And so we put the focus on what they're gaining in terms of those vocal qualities. And so that again keeps us on track with what I'm actually qualified to do with them, as opposed to diverting. And it's very common for people to discover that they do need more therapeutic support after starting, I imagine with any, voice work, body work, massage, because they suddenly realize there is a lot of unresolved stuff. And I always encourage that. I usually have a list of people that I recommend and say, call some, do this. But yeah, it's funny because that was what compelled me. I found my own healing was very much wrapped up in the discoveries around my voice. I witnessed other people's release and healing and change and transformation in my classmates as I studied and trained. And then I've seen this in my clients for 15 years, and I've heard their feedback around my presentations are getting better. I remember one lady said to me, she came ostensibly for speaking up in meetings, business related voice coaching. And we got into smiling and breathing and centering the voice and using a lot of playful kind of connecting exercises. And at the end of her training, she said, my meetings are getting better. She said, but you know what? I find myself laughing almost every day now. And I never used to do that. And I just went, that's amazing.
That's beautiful.
She said, I'm a happier person. And we weren't setting out to make her a happier person, but she found that by way of the training that we've done.
Isn't that beautiful, right? Like, and any type of work that a person requires significant embodiment, training your voice. I would imagine, I've never actually done voice training, but I would imagine that to go through the process of training the voice would require a significant amount of awareness of so many different things, from the technical aspects of where the larynx actually is, to the emotional aspects of what's coming through, to the gesture. Like, there's so much involved in it. So what I mean to say is, it's so beautiful how any practice, be it voice training, massage therapy, yoga, acupuncture, going for a walk, a mindful walk in the park, meditation, the list goes on. Any of these practices tend to lead to people coming out the other side being like, I came in because I have some stiff hamstrings in this yoga class, but I came out being a different person. Right? It's so cool. Yeah. If it's all right with you, I'd like to kind of shift a little bit here. Is that all right?
Yeah. I have one more. I'm going to just let you know, I have one more story about the voice being the raised pitch of the voice. There's another concept that I wanted to bring in. And can I throw that in here? So I was saying about the nervous system and the startle response, and that raises the larynx and creates that higher pitch. There's another phenomenon, and speaks to your example about, oh, it's grandma on the phone, or, oh, there's my boss, or, that feeling we get of, hello, sir, nice to see you. And we suddenly make ourselves proper. We sit up straight, or we start acting and speaking in a different way. Totally. And there's a word for that. It's called code switching. Have you ever heard of code switching?
Code switching? No, go on. Tell me more.
So code switching, there's lots of actually research into this, and there's a really great podcast by a guy called John McWhorter is his name. He's a linguistics and speech expert, and I think the podcast is just called Code Switching. So he digs into topics around communication and cultural influences on communication, that kind of thing. But if I was going to summarize code switching in a broad way, it's the act of changing the way that we behave, including our speech, our clothing, our mannerisms, to conform to a different cultural norm than we might use authentically at our own home. So, the simple idea of, I'm going to work, so I'm going to put on some makeup and dress up a little bit. If you don't wear makeup, or don't, like to live in your sweats and your t-shirts when you're at home, the simple act of putting on a suit and tie or whatever it is you're wearing to work, that's code switching. You're becoming a representation of a different culture. Cool. If you are speaking to your grandmother, hello, grandma, it's nice to see you. And suddenly you don't use any swear words and you speak in this very proper way, or your school teacher voice, that kind of thing. That's code switching. You're trying to conform to the values that are represented by grandma or by, the teacher. And as soon as you're off the phone with them, it's, whatever. And maybe you throw a few curse words in there and you're kind of relaxed. So you're switching back to what feels like your more authentic self. So it's a status thing. It's also, there's a branch of the origins of code switching were in researching African American culture in the United States and looking at why we were getting a sort of a whiteness in speech versus what we can call African American vernacular English, which is a unique dialect amongst Black Americans, some Black Americans. And so researchers were like, why are we hearing these different ways of speaking? So it was originally came out of looking at those structures of oppression and power, right? As an oppressed class of people, culture of people, there was this movement between our people and other people to avoid discrimination. And so that was where the code switching research originally started. That's super fascinating.
That's cool. Yeah. When you said code switching, there was this little twinkle in the back of my mind, and I'm like, I recognize this word from somewhere, but don't remember. As soon as you mentioned the original research, I'm like, that's where it came from, right? And I'm really glad you brought it up, because I've always found that interesting, and I do talk about it a lot when I'm teaching massage therapists. I didn't have the word code switching, but I would talk about this fact, like, you do your best to be authentically you, like that's an essential thing in all business, but particularly these interpersonal businesses, right? Is if you go around as a practitioner acting like somebody you're completely not, that is a recipe for building a career you hate, because you're going to attract clients that you do not vibe with, right? That they're not your client. So do your best to be authentic. That's sitting over here. Like, yes, do that. But simultaneously, it's like, what does that actually mean? Because authentic Jess, he curses. Authentic Jess, this isn't the same Jess that was here 5 minutes ago, or what is more than 5 minutes? What is 40 minutes ago before we started this, right? So it's how do we maintain this authenticity while at the same time acknowledging that code switching turns out to actually be an important part in order to put on the professional facade and do the jobs we all need to do. Or in the example you gave with the studies, kind of a mesh in with a different culture. So I've been so curious, and it's a major preoccupation of mine to figure out this balance between a code switch and a stance in authenticity, right? And I'm sure there is a balance to be had in there.
I think there is, absolutely. And I think the first part of it that's important is awareness. If you don't know that you're doing it, I didn't even notice that my voice changes when I answer the phone, or you're not aware of how that happens, so you don't know what to do with that information. then you can't do anything about it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes we want to do that. Sometimes we want to change our behavior. If it's a choice, I want to speak differently when I'm around certain people. And because I have the skills that let me create the persona that I want, I can make that choice from a place of empowerment.
Yeah.
So code switching is not necessarily a bad thing. It's not necessarily disempowering, not at all. And if you're doing it consciously, then that means that the persona that you're switching into can still be authentic, right? Mm-hmm. The version of me that is a voice teacher is not the same version of me that goes to the pub and has drinks with my friends. Not exactly the same. There's lots of crossover, but I make a conscious choice to leave some things out when I'm teaching because I don't think it's appropriate. But I bring a lot of me to what I do. As you say, I love that you said that, right? If I was trying to be this, hello, I'm a Mary Poppins type of voice teacher, which there are those out there, and that was the way voice teachers were seen for a long time, I would be teaching something I didn't love. And as you said, I'd be working with people that I didn't jive with. So I can create a confident, authentic, professional persona that I know where the boundaries are of what is professional and what isn't professional, what seems appropriate to share with a client and what doesn't seem appropriate to share with a client. And I'm the one creating that. And so for me, that's what lets me feel authentic, even when I know I'm in a role.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes complete sense. And and it kind of leads to an interesting question, one that I was eager to ask, and it's how can one use this? And I think it's an important consideration. I've been more and more aware of this kind of in anticipation of having this discussion when I'm working with clients. So yesterday I had 3 clients back to back. The first client is a friend, but kind of like a casual friend. We know each other, but not super well, right? And then the second client was a client with this like just devastating history of trauma. Like she is such a delicate person that I've already experienced during the session. Like anything can trigger her into a very profound emotional response of just tears. And it's not like it's not a bad thing. It's just who she is. And then the client directly after that, well, was my brother-in-law. You know, we're friends. Like it's fine. And I was so aware of this, code switch. But more importantly, the tone of voice was the biggest difference between them. In particular, I was noticing that second client, the one with this like powerful history of trauma. And I up registered, just, is that the right word? I moved up a little bit and I was just talking a little bit higher and I was using a little bit softer words. And I was being very mindful of my vocabulary to not use, not that she's stupid, she's brilliant, right? But I was being very mindful of my word choice. And I found through a very quick trial and error in my first session with her that interacting with her with normal Jess clinic voice was no bueno. That wasn't going to fly. So I had to shift my voice in order to accommodate her. Right. Yeah. So what I'm getting at is, do you have any, just if you were to kind of summarize it briefly, what kind of tips or what would you suggest for practitioners, any type of wellness practitioner, that they can start to consider within their voice to help impact their clients in a positive way, if that question makes sense?
Yeah. That's an amazing question. It's so interesting. And what a fascinating experience that you had, that, one and then another and then another. And there's talking about code switching, and just shifting, I don't know if that shifting in response to your client. And that's the heart of wellness practice, I think, is that we are always in response to the state of our clients. And that's part of what makes this work for me so interesting and challenging and, curious, is that I don't just show up as me, this is me all the time, me. I'm always a little bit, checking, weighing, measuring, but I can't sacrifice all of who I am to appease someone. So I have to find a way to still feel like me and work with the other person, right? Which is what you're describing. Within the talk of nervous systems and Stephen Porges' work on the vagus, the polyvagal theory, and Peter Levine's work around trauma history and PTSD and that kind of thing, there's something I'm sure you're familiar with called regulating the nervous system and co-regulating the nervous system with another person.
Yeah.
Right? I'm sure co-regulating is in your vocabulary as well. And
Yeah.
so co-regulating, meaning that we can find our calm, find our regulation, find our grounding, not just by working with ourselves, but by sort of mirroring and working with somebody else. Mm-hmm. Right? And so as a practitioner, one of my responsibilities is to work with my client to co-regulate with them. And the ways that we co-regulate are the way that we move, our gesture, our body, that there's a visual cue for your client. The way that we breathe, which is part of that visual. If they can see me breathing slowly and from my center and exhaling gently and slowly, then their body is going to start unconsciously, hopefully mirroring what I'm doing, which will help them slow down, calm down. And then using my voice as well, right? The way that I am speaking will have an influence on them, the vibration of my voice, because here's how it works when we hear someone, right? The vibration of my vocal folds is leaving my mouth and radiating out through my body as vibration. It's traveling into your ear, and it's making the drum of your eardrum vibrate. So although we are not in physical proximity with each other, and we may be in the same room and not touching each other, when I speak and you hear me, my vibration is actually in your ear, making your body vibrate. Mm-hmm. So my voice is actually touching you. And so if I slow my pace down, and actually rather than going higher, and this is something that we might think higher feels safer, but high can also indicate anxiety. Mm-hmm. And so the key that as a voice coach, what I suggest is finding a balanced resonance in the voice so that you're neither, kind of down here and feeling low and rough, but neither are we up here sounding small or nervous, or because that can convey nervousness or anxiety. We want to find a middle place in our voices where we can feel the vibration of our own voice in our chest here, right, but also in our faces. So when you can feel your voice vibrating in your forehead, on the crown of your head, in your cheekbones, and in your chest, that's what I would call in the voice world a balanced resonance. And so there's room there in my voice to be expressive, use my pitch range. But those lower resonances in the voice are the slowest sound waves that we produce. Yeah. And those low, slow sound waves are the ones that tend to calm people down. Mm-hmm. Right? And so if we take those low sound waves out and we just use the a higher pitch is a higher frequency, which is faster moving sound waves, which means their eardrums are going to vibrate faster. Brilliant. So that might actually stimulate them in a way that you don't want. So we can slow down our breathing. We can slow down the rate of speech and work towards feeling. And I literally will, put my own hand on my chest. Can I feel my voice here? Yep. Can I feel my voice here? Okay. Now I know I'm vibrating in a balanced way. And then again, I'll choose language that feels safe for my client. I'll choose a tone or a way of communicating that feels safe for my client. I might reduce the volume of my voice a little bit. But the other thing we have to be careful of is if someone is hard of hearing, or even in a massage setting or bodywork session, their eyes might be closed or they might be face down. And I find that a trap some people can fall into is going so soft and breathy. Well, now you notice the tone in my voice is kind of disappearing. And so actually then it's hard for them to hear you. And so the loss of vocal tone means a loss of vibration, means a loss of co-regulation, right? They're relying on the vibration that's coming to them from you to sort of, is holding them in a state. And so if we go into breathy tone, which means a reduction of vibration, that could actually feel like a disconnection to them. And, or they lose the ability to actually hear you, which could feel frightening. And so then they're having to open their eyes and look around and seek you out in the space because they can't hear you anymore. So there's more energy that can be in the voice that doesn't need to be overstimulating for people. We don't have to go into like a whispered sound in order to help someone feel regulated with us. Yeah. But it does take a fair bit of sophisticated voice use. So I think the easy default for a lot of people is to sort of talk in this kind of soft.
Yeah.
And the soft idea is a good one, but that whisper tone can become disconnecting, and it could lead to some other things. So that's kind of interesting.
Yeah, that's fascinating. A few things came up as you were saying that. One is years ago, I took hypnotherapy training, and to this day, out of all of the certificates and training I've done, I stand by the fact that that was probably the most valuable training I took. And a big part of it was talking about the hypnotherapy voice, you know, like without even if you've never been to a hypnotherapist, you have no, and you say, can you talk like a hypnotherapist? Pretty much everybody on the planet is going to do the same thing. They're going to talk slow. They're going to do down talk, right? Like, so we did spend a lot of time talking about voice and how to use voice. And a lot of it was talking about, what did you say? I can't remember the word you used for it.
The balanced resonance,
voice,
the sort of
balanced resonance,
vibration,
is finding that balanced resonance. There was practice time. I really like that kind of connecting the head and the heart as far as a practice, but we did have to spend time to find the tone of voice that we can maintain for potentially hours on end. That would be fairly consistent. That was relaxing. Like, there was so much time and effort spent on finding this hypnotherapy tone, which kind of brings me to another question, which I really wanted to ask you about. And it's what I call the yoga voice. And admittedly, I don't like the yoga voice. There are a few things that disrupt my practice more. Like, as soon as somebody drops into that yoga voice, I'm like, come on, just talk normal. Like, it 100% disrupts the practice for me.
Yeah.
Now, I don't even know if I can mimic the yoga voice, but one part of it is, in my opinion, breathy. Like, that's part of the characteristic to it.
I would agree with that.
I don't know what else there is in it. So do you know what I mean with yoga voice? I mean, you've been a yoga a bunch. 100%.
100%.
Yeah, tell me about
it drives me bananas.
Okay, thank you.
It drives me bananas because, and I didn't mention this before, but I'll say it now. I'm also slightly hard of hearing. So I've had some dental stuff that has resulted in jaw pressure that's led to some hearing loss, which as a voice teacher is pretty difficult to deal with.
Yeah.
But I'm also very good at reading people's faces, and I didn't realize how much listening I do by watching, right? And so in the last kind of 5 or 6 years, my yoga practice, I've noticed, this is where I first noticed the hearing loss, because I was not looking at the teacher, put my head down on the ground, and she said something, and I thought, why can't I hear her? So I had to look around and find her with my eyes. And then she said, and now turn your head the other way. And I could hear her perfectly fine. And I went, oh my goodness, it's me, it's my ears. And so given that hearing is sometimes a thing, but now I need to feel that tone. I need the vibration of someone's voice reaching me so that I can follow them during a class. And the minute their voice is too breathy, and we're in a studio full of people, and so the voice is not close to me necessarily, I can't feel their voice anymore, so I can't hear them. Yeah. So it drives me bananas on a few different levels.
Yeah.
So and I say that, and I am not meaning any disrespect to yoga teachers, because I love yoga and I love yoga teachers, and I have so many friends who teach yoga. So I'm not meaning that in a disrespectful way. I think it's a well-intentioned, I think it comes from a beautiful place, and I think it's well-intentioned with a little bit of lack of technical knowledge. So what people want to do is what we've already talked about. They want to create a calming atmosphere. Great.
Fair enough.
So they're using a soothing voice. And soothing does tend to be, smooth vocal cadences. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to yoga. What we're going to, that kind of thing, that sort of musical way of speaking. Lovely.
You nailed it.
Right, exactly. So we want to be calming. We want to be soothing. We don't want to jar or disrupt anybody. So we're trying to create a safe space for them. We think that soothing then maybe means we have to be quiet, which isn't necessarily true. You can actually speak with a lot of energy that doesn't feel like a blast or an attack. Okay. When people are doing yoga or dance or sport or anything that's fitness related, there's one important piece there that is in direct contrast to healthy, easy voice use. And that is the way that you use your core muscles. When we do yoga, we talk about engaging the bandhas, lifting up the pelvic floor, activating the deep core muscles to support the back and make sure we can move our body effectively and safely. Important. But to speak effectively, you need a responsive core. Your transverse abdominis muscle and your pelvic floor muscles need to release and engage and release and engage while you're speaking. Those muscles engage to support the exhalation, speaking out, and they need to slightly release, not necessarily fully release, slightly release on the inhalation to take the pressure off of the structures at the top. And so if you're teaching, and I see this all the time with teachers who are beautiful practitioners, but they are practicing with a locked up core or an engaged core, and almost always their voice work isn't effective because they don't understand that they need the responsive core for the teaching part. And so it's a huge challenge. The doer of yoga needs to practice working those muscles, and the teacher of yoga actually has to have a different relationship to their core. So that's another part of it. And then the other thing that happens, and I can see this happening in the hypnotherapy world as well, they just put on a voice without actually paying close attention to the words that they're saying. And so we fall into a pattern that sounds a little bit like, okay, everybody, we're going to start off with downward facing dog. And what I'd like you to do is raise your right foot up into the air and then roll over onto your left hand side. So there's that tone that's calming and sort of lovely. I'm sorry, what did you just say to me? Because what I missed was the instruction contained within the words.
Yeah.
And so what we tend to do is drop the energy of the voice as we come to the end of a phrase or a statement. But guess what? When we're constructing language in English, the most important information usually comes towards the end. Totally. So I want you to raise your right foot up in the air and then swing that foot forward and place it outside your right hand. Where my foot is going to go was the last thing I said, but that was really important because otherwise your practitioner like me, who's a little bit deaf and can't hear you, is like, what? My foot's in the air. You want me to put it? What do I do with it? And I have to look around at everyone else and and then it looks like I'm judging and comparing. I'm like, no, I just didn't hear the part. Where does my foot go? And so understanding that our responsibility is to the instruction that we're giving as well as the emotional space that we're creating. And so activating the language using your speech muscles, swinging your right foot through and placing it outside your right hand and using those consonant sounds contained in those words, because the consonant sounds are what give words structure. That's how we hear the intellectual meaning of a word. The vowel sounds are what gives us emotion. And that's where we do that beautiful breathe in and exhale. We might extend those vowel sounds because we're trying to kind of convey that emotional release. But if you want me to do something complex with a body part, I need consonant energy. And I need energy in the instruction words themselves. And that's what's missing for me a lot, particularly in yoga teaching.
Yeah, I just learned a ton about that, and so many ideas came up. Like even hearing your examples, the breathy sort of instruction in myself. Two things happened. I noticed how quickly I tuned out. Like you said 2 lines, and I was like, "What? What are we talking about?"
Yep.
Like I was gone.
Yeah,
and like not bored, just like I stopped paying attention.
Yeah.
And the second thing
is, you lost my vibration. You lost my vibration.
Okay, that makes complete sense, and it was quick. And then the second thing I noticed, which is likely because I lost your vibration, is I felt anxious. Like I didn't like it. But as soon as you started to speak, I call it teacher voice, with these consonant-driven words or pronunciation, it was so much more calming. Like even though it was directive and the words had hard stops to them, I found it like, thank you. Please continue to talk to me like that. Yeah. And additionally, there was this little voice in the back of my mind that said, the first one, the voice was like, don't talk to me like I'm a child. It was this like this frustration, like just don't talk to me like that. And the second one was like, thank you. I appreciate being spoken to this way. So fascinating how I received this tiny little example as well.
Yeah. Isn't that's amazing? I love that. All those inner conversations that start in our heads, right? And which is so funny because yoga talks about that as part of philosophy, right? What's our inner chatter? What are we bringing to the mat? I can remember in my 20s, I could never get my brain to shut up. Never. I'd be there doing something, and just constantly chatter. It's taken me years to try to train that part of my mind, or at least acknowledge it and work with it. Mm-hmm. And so we can't help, as a teacher, you can't control what's going on inside the minds of your students. That's part of their journey. But you can use your voice in a way that is effective. And here's another one of the challenges. If you're teaching one-to-one, okay, and as you do, you know, working one-to-one in a small space with a client, that's slightly different. Using a moderating the volume of your voice so they don't feel like you're yelling at them is really important, right? But sometimes the reason we end up feeling kind of a bit pushed, you know, and a bit forward with our voices is because our core muscles are grabbing and punching a little bit, as opposed to gently engaging to support the sound. So a tight core, or a core that's holding, can produce a voice that tends to be a bit loud or feels a bit sort of punchy. But if you were teaching a class, and so this was true for me as a voice teacher, I would have a group of anywhere from 8 to 18 students. And so I would be walking around the room, just like in a yoga class, giving an instruction, a complex, you know, body scan or series of movements. And my students are all spread out around the room, lying on the floor, lying on their stomachs, you know, just like in yoga. They're not looking at me, and I don't want them to necessarily. And I am speaking to 18 people all at once. And so the energy that I need, and the room itself is quite big because it can hold 18 people. Yoga studios are often quite spacious. And so I actually need my voice to be strong enough and clear enough to imagine that I'm throwing a line of energy to every single one of the people in that room. Totally. Right? And so of necessity, that means I actually am using quite a lot of energy from my body, and my tone is still smooth. My voice still sounds calm, but I'll tell you, it's work. And it's when teachers don't fully recognize that you have to speak to 18 or 20, or in a yoga class, 25 or 30 people all at once. Your voice has to fill the space. Yeah. And going breathy and quiet will not do that. No. And so I sort of always picture myself as like, I'm at this kind of center point because I'm the one talking, but like a wheel with spokes going out. And there's a spoke that goes from me, or a spoke sounds a bit aggressive, but there's like a line, like a little fishing line of energy that goes from me to every single person in the room, even the ones who are behind me. And so I actually think about sending my voice out the back of my body when I'm teaching, which is something you can do. You can resonate backwards so that I don't just make the mistake of thinking my voice forward.
Yeah, I get you.
And yeah. So that's, so that the energy that's required to reach all of your students in a group class means you will be using your voice with lots of energetic dynamic. It's just not loud and it's not shouty. And you're using your speech sounds then to help create some of the clarity that you need. Does that make, I'm sort of talking around in circles now, I think, but does that make sense?
No, it makes complete sense. And as you're describing, I actually was teaching a workshop, a massage workshop last week and the week before, I don't know, recently. And it was a huge room. Like there were 26 students, and that filled up maybe a third of the space. Massive room. And there were these vents that were on super loud, right? So the facilitators, they brought in a mic system, right? And I put the mic on, and it lasted 5 seconds before I'm like, I can't do this, because the mic had a millisecond delay, and I'm like, I got confused. So I'm like, no, forget it. So then I spent 2 days casting my voice out to 26 people. Yeah. I was very close to shouting volume to get it to the back of the room, but still, like you said, not shouting, maintaining a tone where everybody felt like we were having a conversation, but still having my voice like cranked in volume, right? Like, wow, it was a lot of work. Like at the end of the day, I was just, not only was I wiped from teaching and, you know, doing the teacher thing where you're just like happy and thinking like there's a lot of levels of exhaustion, but simply speaking at that volume with maintaining all of the characteristics that you described was, whew, it pooped me out. Yeah.
It's a massive workout, right? There's research that has shown that public speaking is a cardiovascular workout because of the pressure up from the diaphragm and the activation of the rib cage. You are pumping your heart and your lungs forcefully. Speaking out is a forced exhalation. It's a type of forced exhalation. So speaking publicly with energy and dynamic and volume is a cardiovascular workout. And of necessity, it involves every single part of your body. It is a whole body fitness experience. So actors, when you see actors on stage or professional singers, they are incredibly fit because your whole self is what creates your voice. And that goes back to what my teacher was saying to me that day back in my 20s. What is the voice? It is a response to your whole system. And to be a speaker, a healthy, passionate, connected, clear, sensitive speaker, you have to tune in to your entire body, from your toes to the crown of your head to the tips of your fingers.
So true. Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, we've hit an hour here, but I do have one more question. Okay. Do you have time for just one
more?
Yeah,
of course. Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And I really, really appreciate this conversation. I've learned so much. So thank you.
No, thank you. I love talking about it. I love sharing the conversation with other, other people, not just me talking into a void of this is what I believe in.
No, I get it. And it's so valuable. But my last question is actually based around TCM. So in Chinese medicine, there's a bunch of different ways we could practice, right? And one of the particular, I call them lenses. One of the particular lenses we can look through is this lens called the 5 elements lens, right? And essentially, everything is broken down into 5 elements. And without going into a TCM lecture, one of the things that we see within 5 elements, or one of the aspects of these 5 elements, is used for diagnosis. So when it comes to diagnosis of 5 elements, we ask questions, but we really don't care what the answer is, because the only reason we're asking questions is to simply get somebody to speak. And we're trained to listen to 2 aspects. So there are 4 different pillars to the 5 elements diagnostic system. 2 of them have to do with voice and sound.
Really?
And it would, the other one is smell. And then the last one is observation. What do we see? The color of their skin and things like that, right? But 2 of them have to do with sound, which I always found so fascinating. It's like, we're only given 4 tools. 2 of them sound, really? But we spend time learning about voice.
Interesting. I did not know that. That's so interesting.
Pretty cool, right?
Yeah.
And we say there are 5 voices, one for each of the 5 elements. You know, you've got a fire voice, you've got an earth voice, a metal voice, and you've got a water voice, and lastly you have a wood voice. And some of the things we're taught is a wood voice in harmony versus a wood voice out of harmony. And we're learning that with all of these elements, right? So part of what we learn about is to really cue into one thing you said is this a punchy voice? Is it a sing-song voice that's got a lot of dynamic to it? Is it not a monotone voice, but very little inflection and high degree of pronunciation and precision?
Clipped maybe, or precise, or
Or is it just like a bubbly, sort of talking really fast, right? Like, so there are these 5. So in order, the first one, the punchy, that was wood. And then the sing-song voice, that's earth, right? This like motherly sort of, hey, everybody's happy, right? And then we get the clipped voice, that's metal. And then we get the bubbly sort of fast talking, that's fire. And then water is go with the flow. So it's just like chill pace. It's like, hey, man, it's all good, right? So anyways, we're talking about these 5 voice characteristics, and we use it, again, as one of the main pillars to identify dysfunction. Now, what I'm curious about, and what I'd really like your take on, is we talked a little bit about how we can use maybe the register of somebody's talking a little bit up here versus a little bit lower within the lens of, now, side note, interestingly enough, there's this book called The Tao of Trauma, where an author takes the 5 elements system and overlaps it to Peter Levine's system of trauma response. Brilliant, by the way. So tangent done. Aside from this first conversation we had, what do you think about using the tone of our client's voice as a method? Now, I know in most modalities, like massage being one of them, we can't diagnose, but I'm going to use the word anyways. What do you think about using the sound of our client's voice as a mode or a method of diagnosis?
100%. It's, and as you say, it's not an official diagnosis, but it's an assessment tool, and it brings a lot of information. You know, for me, when I hear, and I love the 5 elements descriptions of voices, you know, in coming from an acting background, and, you know, we try to use as much creative language that inspires imagination as possible. And then there's also the technical language of anatomy and function and biomechanics that is important, because that's the credibility, right? That speaks to the fact that I actually know what I'm talking about, as opposed to just give me your best fluffy wood leprechaun creature and someone going, is this based in anything, or are you just making stuff up, right? And so in my world, I walk the line between creative expression and technical verification all the time. But hearing the way that someone speaks, and knowing, as you say, if they're speaking really quickly and their voice sounds a little bit light and not that strong, and I think you described that as a fire voice.
Yeah, fire voice is kind of quick talking and bubbly.
Quick talking,
but
rapid.
Then we talk about dysfunctional voices, right? Like a fire voice that's dysfunctional. When we hear that, it's like it's kind of cracked. It's not cryy. That's more of a metal voice, but it's kind of cracked, and it just doesn't have energy. It's not depressed, but that's kind of a fire voice that's dysfunctional.
100%, got it. And so to me, when I know about how the larynx works, the larynx is a valve, right? It's a valve that regulates breathing primarily. Okay, its number one job is to be the airway and keep our lungs safe and close off when we swallow something or breathe in something that's not going to be healthy for us. So that's the primary function of the larynx. The secondary function of the larynx is speech. Actually, I think there's another function, and speech is the third one, but I've forgotten it now. So speaking is not actually, it's an accident of our evolution that we even can speak. Okay, which I'm sure
beautiful accident.
Right, a beautiful accident. And so, but that means that when the way that someone's speech comes out of their mouth is telling us everything we need to know almost about what the valve is doing, the larynx is doing, and we know that the larynx operates by either being raised or lowered through muscle tension, muscle effort, sorry, not necessarily tension, and it needs a flow of breath to power it, to fuel it properly. So if someone's voice is cracking and the tone is cutting out right away, it has to do with how they're breathing. They're not actually supporting and sustaining the flow of breath, which would tell me that they're probably breathing too high. So there's something going on, over efforting in the upper body. And then there's probably some sort of restriction going on in their lower rib area, abdominal area, maybe pelvic floor, maybe hips. And so as a voice teacher, I would hear that symptom of cracking voice, maybe a weak tone. Right away, I know there's something to do with a lack of connection to their core and an over-efforting going on in the upper body. There's compensation happening at the top. And then asking more questions and watching the way that they move is going to tell me, you know, where to go with my next steps. And so all of those qualities of voice that you're describing, exactly that. Someone can be have a healthy, fast-talking voice where that's not a problem, right? But the minute they're talking too fast, running out of breath, their voice is cracking, the tone is cutting out, well, then I know already that the breathing system, mechanical system is not working. And so it becomes a tool for assessment and diagnosis, at least of the first stage of what it is we need to work on. And I have found in my teaching, people come and, oh, I want to work on my voice. I listen to them speak. I watch the way that they're breathing. And I go, okay, you know what we need to start with? Your pelvis and your feet. And they go, I'm sorry, what? I came to you to do. And I'm like, yeah, but I can see and hear that the blockages, the imbalances are starting so far away from the voice, from where the voice is made, that if we start working up here, we haven't changed anything yet. And it can sometimes be a little bit of a trick to get people to trust me, to go, we're going to do some stuff with your feet first, or we're going to do some lying on the floor and rocking your pelvis around. And, you know, they're kind of going, so I have to kind of get them there sometimes a little bit indirectly. But so it's an absolutely valid tool. I also read a research study that I wish I could remember where I read it, that they are now using voice recordings to make assessments for health problems. Like by reading by reading the print, the voice print of someone's voice, they can now diagnose certain health conditions, and they're actually starting to research that. So it's something that voice teachers and TCM practitioners and these healing arts that have been around for thousands of years, there's a reason why you learned about the voice in your training, because it is a diagnostic tool. It's just that modern science hasn't verified that through research in the same way that we verified EKGs and, cardiograms and MRIs and that kind of thing. And I wish I could remember where I read, I should really back that up with a bit of research, but I read that recently and went, absolutely, you can tell what's going on within people,
Yeah,
So,
I strongly believe so. I certainly do.
Yeah, me too.
Well, I'm pretty sure I could continue this conversation for another 2 hours, but let's tie a bow on it for today. And I really, really appreciate your time. I would like you to answer just this final question that I get everybody to answer, if you don't mind.
Okay.
And having been a massage therapist and a yoga teacher and now a voice coach, and I'm sure there were quite a few other things in there, I'm sure you'll have a very fascinating answer to this. So my curiosity is, in your opinion, in your experience, what do you think makes a good practitioner, or perhaps what do you think what makes a practitioner successful? Either one of those.
General practitioner, like anyone working in the wellness field, or a voice practitioner?
Yeah, anybody in the wellness space. Yeah.
What a good question. I think you have to have a balance between a high level of empathy and really strong boundaries. I think that so many of us are probably drawn to this business because we are highly empathetic and such compassionate people. But as I'm sure you know and I know, it's really easy to burn out really fast when all you're doing is giving. And so, for me, learning the boundaries came later. Learning the compassion was easy. So I think that's an important, very important, essential skill. I think an open-mindedness and a curiosity to other modalities of healing is really important. I teach voice and movement and breath. And so, of course, I, think my niche of the market is so fascinating and great, but I will never, ever shut down anyone else's practice or speak negatively about another a pocket in the wellness market, because it's all valid. And just because something doesn't work for me doesn't mean it doesn't work for you or for whoever. Brilliant. And so sort of having the back of other practitioners, and being open-minded to the validity in all practice. And so I think that helps us respect that perhaps the different modalities our clients are using to get their results. I have clients who seek out massage and yoga and all kinds of different things that I'm not teaching them. And so I'm very aware of never, trying to down talk or speak against anything else that they're doing, because we're all have the same goal. And then I think a really important piece is the desire and the willingness to be on a constant journey of personal growth. I think, and that's not always comfortable, and especially when we're used to being in that position of we're the authorities, we're the ones with the training and the credentials, and we're the givers, the healers, but if we stop growing, then I think our knowledge can start to become stagnant. And stagnancy is what happens when you're not growing. Yeah. And, not to say we have to always be demanding something new, there's a difference between finding a comfortable place to inhabit but noticing, when is that becoming stagnant? And when do we actually need to feed our own training, our own knowledge, work through some of our own stuff, progress ourselves forward as people and as teachers. And the best practitioners that I've ever known are ones who constantly push their knowledge, their skill forward, but are also always open to their own personal growth and development. And it's that mix that I think makes truly magical practitioner.
Brilliant. That's a great answer. Thank you so much. Yeah. And thank you again for your time. I really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure, Jess. Thank you for having me. This is so much fun. I really, really had a good time.
Great. Awesome.